2, 1. Our recording is going, and we're just going to jump right into the show. So we are going to get started in 3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome. Welcome and hello. This is Wait, You Haven't Seen? It's a show where we talk about movies, and specifically, we talk about a movie at least one of us has never seen before. I'm your host, Travis, aka TV's Travis. This is episode number 218, and our movie this week is 1992's Reservoir Dogs, written and directed by Quentin Tarantino. And here to talk with me about it, closing out So Wizard month of May, is Aubrey. Aubrey, how you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Good. So, originally you came to me with Pulp Fiction, was what you'd finally
Nice.
narrowed it down to, and I've done that one on the show already. So I was like, well, I've done
Mhm.
that, but here, and I think Joey was like, she had a couple others that she hadn't seen, and one of those was Reservoir Dogs, and I said, well, let's do that. We'll stay on the Tarantino train. So give me any sort of history or background you have with Reservoir Dogs before watching it for this.
I would say the only background is that I used to confuse it for Lords of Dogtown.
Aha.
I don't even know why. But I used to confuse it for that all the time. So then I'd see it on Netflix. I'd be like, oh, it's Lords of Dogtown, that stupid movie about skateboarding. And then I'd be like, oh, well, no, 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 wait, no, it's not. And then I would turn it.
It's a slightly different movie. So, are you? Do you have you seen many of Tarantino's films? Are you much of a Tarantino fan at all?
No, I am not an action person. I am not um blood and gore. Like he's just very much so out of my wheelhouse.
Okay, all right. So having watched this now for the first time, what did you think overall? Like, how did it hit you as just a movie and watching it for the first time?
I I was very bored. It's,
That's fair.
it's a lot of talking. It's a lot of talking.
So that's the interesting thing with Tarantino is he gets lumped in as like action a lot of times, and really his movies are just people talking. That's the majority of his stuff. He's very dialogue heavy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I am not a dialogue heavy lady.
Well, I also like that this gets sometimes lumped into like best heist movies. I've seen that show up on lists for that, and even Tarantino has said he loves seeing it on lists like that because it's a heist movie where you never see the heist. That's
Yeah, it's like a lot of backstory for like what's going on in a single scene. There's
mhm.
like it's like this single scene movie, and then the rest of it is all the backstory leading up to that point. And it's I saw the reviews are like really high for this.
Yeah. So this movie came out in 1992. I'll give a little background on the movie itself. Written and directed by Quentin Tarantino. He actually put on the script written by and to be directed by Quentin Tarantino when he wrote it way back when. And I had read the script for this movie before I ever saw it. I saw it in high school in the late 90s, mid to late 90s. But somebody that I knew that I went to school with had gotten a copy of the script. It had been floating around in early internet stuff. And so I had read a copy of the script prior to seeing the movie, which was a first for me. I'd never done that before. That was kind of interesting. He wrote this and initially was going to shoot it himself on 16 millimeter film, and he was going to shoot it in black and white. And he had a budget. He was going to scrape together like $30,000 to make it. And his friend, one of the producers, Lawrence Bender, who is actually one of the police officers chasing Steve Buscemi in like the one action sequence in the movie, he was taking an acting class, and he took the script to his acting class and showed it to the acting coach, whose wife was friends with Harvey Keitel. And so the story goes that she got the script to Harvey Keitel, who loved it and wanted not only to be in the movie, but he would help produce it, which gave them immediately bumped the budget up to like $1.5 million to be able to film it,
That's awesome.
but also gave them name recognition because now they had Harvey Keitel, who even in 1991, he was already an established Hollywood person. And it gave them the ability to, it unlocked a lot of doors for more producers to join, as well as Harvey Keitel helped fund some casting calls that they did in New York City. So they could cast across the country as well and get a different pool of actors, which is where they ended up finding Steve Buscemi, Michael Madsen, and somebody else. Might have been Tim Roth. I don't remember. But basically,
Mhm.
Harvey Keitel, without him, this movie is probably not remembered. Certainly
Mhm.
not in the way that it is now. So that was a big thing for him at the time. And this is Tarantino's basically his directorial debut. He had done a tiny little micro budget, like 70-minute film a few years before this. And then he went to Sundance in 91 and took a bunch of, they had like courses and like workshops that you could do. And so he took the script with him in 1991 to Sundance and shot some stuff and was getting like tips and pointers from directors and people that were at Sundance. One of whom was Terry Gilliam, um,
Mhm.
who actually like loved the ideas that he was going for and so the visual style that he did. And so he thanked him in the movie, which I thought was kind of cool. In the end credits, there's a special thanks to Terry Gilliam. Um, but he managed to get the budget for it and he made this movie and this was his first feature film and it blew up. Um, some critics didn't love it initially, but like the festival circuit did. Although he got Tarantino said he got to the point of counting the people that would walk out of the movie because, and you can probably back this up. It's not a movie for everyone, and especially
Yeah.
early 1990s film festivals. This isn't what you would think of for a film festival movie in the first place.
Mhm.
And so he was like, "No, I get it. It's not the mountain that everyone's going to be able to climb." Famously, Wes Craven was one of the people that walked out of a screening of this movie,
That's
which
pretty cool.
I thought was pretty impressive. But the way Tarantino put it was, and it was mostly right around a specific scene we'll talk about with a straight razor. Um,
Yeah.
and he even said, like Tarantino said, he wanted that scene to be uncomfortable. So he sort
Mhm.
of got what he was going for with it. But it just amazes me that for a young, unproven director to be able to get the cast of people that he did for this, who went on to have great careers. Some of whom worked with him a lot, and some of whom just did did move on and do other stuff. Like there's a lot of talent involved in making of this particular film, and it shows. I think it shows in his filmmaking. Even if the subject matter isn't for you, there's like things you can spot and notice that he does. It's very subtle. That if you do ever watch the movie again, you may see. We'll get to whether or not you would watch this again. But was there anybody in the cast particularly that either you like immediately recognized or stood out to you?
Of course I knew Steve Buscemi.
Mm-hmm.
He's been in a whole bunch of stuff that I've seen. Tim Roth, I also recognized. I I recognized the person that played Joe Cabot, but I couldn't figure out why I know that person.
Mm-hmm.
He's been in a whole lot of stuff. I looked up his IMDb. He's been in a whole bunch of stuff,
Yeah.
but I couldn't quite place him. Chris Penn too. I recognize Chris Penn. He also looks like somebody else. And I can't figure out who exactly that is either, but he looks like somebody else that's in a bunch of stuff too. I want to say like somebody with Steve Buscemi. That I feel
Oh,
like he's
okay.
been in something with him.
Because I mean, Chris Penn
Um,
does look a little like his brother Sean Penn. Um,
yeah, he does, but he also has a voice like somebody else too. But I couldn't place. He sounds just like somebody, and I really can't.
yeah.
It's like that nasally kind
Mm-hmm.
of voice that he's got going, kind of like Michael. My goodness, I'm blanking on his name too, but he's also in a whole bunch of like New York City stuff. And he was in, oh goodness,
I'm trying to
and
think of
been in a
some.
whole bunch of
I'm
stuff.
trying to think
Yeah,
of some Michaels. The only names coming to mind
he's
right
got
now
red
are
hair, red curly
oh
hair.
Rappaport.
Yes, yes, yes.
Hmm.
He kind of reminds me of him a little bit too.
I could see. I can see a little bit of that. Sure, especially they've got the same kind of
Yeah.
curly hair. They're both tall. Chris Penn is taller than you would think, and you don't really think about it until you see him standing next to like Harvey Keitel, and you're like, oh yeah, no, that guy's kind of tall.
Yeah, and they kind of have like New York City accent,
Hmm.
like
Yeah. Yep. Oh,
kind
Rappaport
of
definitely
thing
does.
going on.
Phil Root in the
Yeah.
chat mentions Lawrence Tierney, by the way, is who played Joe Cabot. He was Elaine's dad in Seinfeld, so you might remember him. I mean, he's been acting
Okay,
forever.
maybe.
There's a great line in this where he uses the line "Dead as Dillinger," referencing
Mhm.
John Dillinger. He played John Dillinger in a movie back in like the 40s or 50s or something like that. He apparently was
Yeah, there's like a lot
difficult.
of those little Easter eggs.
Yeah, he apparently was really difficult to work with too. I guess he got
I could see
fired.
that.
Like Tarantino fired him 3 days in and then rehired him because he couldn't he couldn't remember his lines, and he was just kind of this big brutish guy. And I guess he pushed Tarantino at some point, but then so he fired him, but then he hired him back. But in the meantime, he had gotten drunk. The story goes now. I'm sure some of this is true, but the story goes that he got drunk, shot some holes in his apartment wall, and got arrested and was in jail over the weekend and got bailed out to go back to the movie set on Monday by his agent. So,
That's awesome.
he was a little tough to work with. The character of Mr. Blue, who's basically just in that first scene sitting around the diner table, is played by Edward Bunker, who was a real criminal. He had been a criminal and a
Oh, that's really
novelist.
cool.
And he has a story that apparently he got in a fist fight with Lawrence Tierney back in the 50s, but Tierney doesn't remember it at all. But Bunker told that story. And I guess they had him, like Eddie Bunker, as he was credited in this, or Edward Bunker. He was a criminal. He had written a novel, at least one novel. But he would often be like a technical advisor on films with criminals, like Heat. Michael Mann's Heat, he was a technical
Hmm.
advisor on, and he acted in a movie based on his novel. And he said, and I love this quote, is like, yeah, some of this movie is kind of not realistic. Like, you wouldn't do a job with a bunch of people you don't know, and you wouldn't all dress the same and then go out to breakfast the morning of the job. Because then if then people can just be like, oh yeah, we saw a group of guys all dressed like that at the diner. Like, I get that, but at the same time, it's just kind of a cool, like, that opening scene is so iconic for this movie, and it really sets the tone. That opening scene sets the tone for all of the characters, and that's kind of the stuff that Tarantino is so good at doing. And he is an
Hmm.
acquired taste. If you don't like, you either like Tarantino films or you don't like Tarantino films. He's unapologetic in terms of the dialogue that he writes, the types of characters that he writes, and then the visuals that he puts on screen, whether it be violence or whatever. He's unapologetic in all of that. It's just what he does. But he's also such a good, like, you can tell how much of a student of filmmaking he is and was, because of things like this is his directorial debut, and he's doing all sorts of fun little things that that opening scene in the diner, it establishes who everyone is and who they are in the
Hmm.
group. Mr. White is very protective, especially of like other people. He's the one that pushes
Hmm.
back against the tipping and is like, you don't know what you're talking about. This is very important for the women that work as waitresses and all of this. Like, that's his stance immediately. Mr. Pink is like, I don't care about anybody. I do my own thing. They even establish basically that they established in the beginning of the movie that Mr. Orange is the rat, because he immediately rats out Mr. Pink as soon as Joe comes back saying, "Who didn't put in $1?" He's like, "It's Mr. Pink," and he points right at him. Like,
That's a good point.
and it's
Yeah,
a
that's a good point. I
subconscious.
haven't even.
Yeah, like, you don't think about that, but if you watch it a second time, you'll catch that. You'll catch all sorts of little things, like Joe has a trust of Mr. Blonde because he's the one And they have a bond that is different from everyone else at the table, but you don't really think about it until you've watched through the movie and you see what he's done and all of this. So it's kind of neat that way. I like that. Or there's little visual things too. There's the scene. So Tarantino also has this thing of doing chronology out of order. He doesn't like to make a movie that's just time progressing A to B to C. He likes to mix things up. You kind of notice that in this, where we get
Hmm.
scenes and then it's like we flash back to character background. Um, and there's a scene early on where Steve Buscemi and Harvey Keitel go off into another room to talk and get away from the Tim Roth character, and they're splashing water on their face, washing their hands off, all of that. There's a really cool thing. If you go back and watch this, you'll see on the wall behind them is a bunch of bottles of cleaning supplies, and there is pink and white
Hmm.
stuff that's all on one side of the counter, and then some orange cleaning supplies that are separate over on the other side of the counter.
Oh, that's really
And
cool.
yeah, it's like I saw this movie probably like 5 or 6 times before I ever noticed that. And I was like, "Oh, look at that. They're separating stuff out, and there's little things like that you catch that
Yeah.
it's just kind of fun, like Easter eggy filmmaking things that I'm always fascinated by. Like you put these things in to subconsciously tell people stuff without having to just come right out and say it. It's that
Mhm.
show don't tell idea of film. Um,
Yeah, he's very detailed in aspects that people don't really think about.
mhm. Yeah, and he's very particular in the types of shots that he composes, and
Hmm.
I like some people may call it, especially in this film, amateurish, but I kind of like some of the shots he does because there's one in particular when Mr. Pink and Mr. White are fighting, and there's that iconic shot of him standing over with the gun pointed at him, and he's on the ground with his gun pointed up, and the camera slowly backs away, and you don't think about it at first, but then you suddenly start to realize that we're getting Mr. Blonde's perspective. We're seeing this play out from him standing over on the other side of the room as the camera slowly
Hmm.
backs up, and then we see Mr. Blonde standing there. It's a cool reveal
Yeah.
because it's just a cool looking shot, and then it's like, oh, we're just gonna back up from this, okay? And then they're really small in the frame. There's a lot of very like weird shots where everybody's small in the back part of the frame, which is
Hmm.
doesn't it makes you feel like you're just observing stuff happening as opposed to being in on the action and part of it. You're kind of a fly on the wall watching these guys all unravel in this warehouse because you're looking down a hallway seeing them, and you might only see one of them, but they're having a conversation the whole time too, which I thought was kind of cool. I like that. Um,
Yeah, it is a very different perspective.
mhm. It's very independent film, I think is what I would
Yes.
call this, because it's also a lot of long takes. And you might sit on a non-moving camera for a minute or two as dialogue goes on, and you're not doing coverage. You're not getting in close-ups on everybody as everybody is speaking and seeing their faces. So you're left. You really have to listen to the dialogue in order to absorb what's going on in the film, which I think is a cool stylistic choice too. Depending on and obviously your mileage may vary on if that works for you or not. But I think what it does is it pulls you in to listen to the words that are being spoken. Um, and because Tarantino is so into his dialogue, he wants that. He wants to rope you in there and hold you in that moment instead of giving you a cut where you got to look at something else and see somebody else's face. You're forced to kind of listen to them talk, and you can't be distracted by anything else in the frame. I think is the way I would put it.
Yeah, he is very minimalist in a lot of his sets, it seems. In like it draws your attention towards the actual thing that's going on rather than having to look around and see what's going on in the other room. Or it like even with some of his other movies, I want to say like he directed Django, right? I'm
Yes.
pretty sure he did.
Yep.
Yeah, and
Django
even
Unchained. Yeah.
yeah, even that was very minimalist in certain aspects. Like everything was it's not a very busy set. It's not a very busy scene.
No, most of the time it's not, because again, like, he's not an action director. He's I wouldn't call him the opposite of Michael Bay, but he's closer to a Kevin Smith than a Michael Bay in terms of, like,
Hmm.
Kevin Smith makes movies, and the whole joke for him for a long time was he never moves the camera, right? He just sets a
Yeah.
camera in locked off, and he has people talking, and that's a lot of what Tarantino does. He has little bits of action mixed in here and there, but for the most part, his movies are very dialogue driven, and he's kind of that's what interests him. But he definitely just brings in all sorts of influences from things. He loves Hong Kong cinema, so he made Kill Bill, which had
Hmm.
outstanding action sequences. And then, he'll pull from this movie. Famously, was people were saying, well, he plagiarized a film called what was the name of it now? Mark even mentioned it when I posted on Twitter about doing this. He's like, yeah, I like this movie better when it was, and he gave the name of it, but it was a Hong Kong film from a few years earlier. And
Hmm.
Tarantino said in an interview, well, yeah, I stole from that movie. I steal from every movie I've ever seen. Like, of course. And he's never been shy about that. But what he did was he took kind of the last, like, 10, 20 minutes of that movie. The plots is very similar to the plot of Reservoir Dogs, where it's a band of
Hmm.
criminals, and a lot of the story beats are the same. But he took that small section of that movie, expanded it out to an hour and 40 minutes, and then put in his own spin and his own dialogue and his own style to it. And that, I think, is true of filmmakers. They take what they've seen before or what's influenced them, and they work it into their films. And sometimes they're very obvious in it, and sometimes it's very subtle. I mean, George
I
Lucas.
feel like that's true for all creatives too. I mean, painters, they see
Mhm.
something beautiful, they're going to take that and repaint it. And musicians, they hear a key that they like in a different song, they're going to base another song off of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the idea of artists, stealing or copying from other artists. Well, you can do that as long as you make it something your own at the same time.
Hmm.
You're Because it's impossible to not be influenced by what you see. Um, City on Fire, by the way, is the movie that I was referencing. It's 1987, I think, is when that one came out. Um, and so there's a lot of very similar story elements in the end of that movie to Reservoir Dogs. But Reservoir Dogs is one of those that's like it's been copied to death since then, since
Hmm.
1992. This was a huge movie from an independent film standpoint, very similar to like Clerks a couple of years later, which really invigorated independent film and showed that you can make something on a low budget that has very little kind of action going on, and it's all dialogue, but it can be very engaging and very funny. Tarantino showed that you can do basically an action movie without any action. And I'm always fascinated by
Hmm.
stuff like that. We get the few minutes before the heist, we get everything after the heist. The heist itself is all in our head. And
Yeah. Yeah, and we get a very good image of how it went down because we hear them complaining, but
yeah, and even like the most of the violence in the movie, you don't physically see it happen. Like the probably the most famous scene from this movie is the torture scene with the cop. There's a
hmm.
we get the famous. It's a very famous Tarantino shot style, which is looking up from the open trunk of a car. If you ever watch his
Hmm.
movies, that happens all the time. I think that it's like if you're watching a Tarantino movie and there's a car in it, somebody's going to be in that trunk or looking into the trunk, and you're going to see somebody's feet. That's just Tarantino. It's what he
Hmm.
does. But we get that they bring the cop in, played by Kirk Balls, and then there's a very famous scene where he gets tortured by Mr. Blonde, who is basically a sadist.
Hmm.
Um, and that scene is rough, but when you watch it, the actual act of violence, the camera moves away from it. And so what we see again is everything leading up to that moment. Then we pull the camera off and we hear it, and then we get the aftermath of it. And I think that actually makes that scene more difficult to
Hmm.
watch than if we had seen what they'd initially shot, which was they had a special effect showing him cutting the ear off. Like they made a prosthetic that fit over it and everything. I think not having that there makes it more difficult because now your brain is filling in those blanks and you're almost forced to picture it in your head in
Yeah,
that moment.
and that can be worse.
Yeah, much worse. It's the whole idea of don't show your monster or show your monster sparingly because what's in your audience's head is often scarier than the creature design you can come up with. And so like by pulling the camera away, I think forces you to be inside that moment with what's going on to that police officer, especially still having the audio of him along with the song, which is so discordant to what's going on. There's so much that mixes into that scene. Were you familiar with that song?
I know I was, yeah. I knew that song and also Hooked on a Feeling.
Okay.
Uh, yeah.
But yeah, like this movie is a big reason why that song regained popularity. And it's so out of place with the actions on screen that are going on. And it's like it's perfect for what they were going for in that scene. And it works. But it works because it's this happy, upbeat, peppy song in sort of a Bob Dylan style. And he's cutting off a guy's ear and slashing it with a razor. It's like, yeesh. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and Tarantino's really good at doing that. He's good at picking songs for movies. There's like certain directors have that ability. And they kind of know the music that they want to do, or they work really well with their music supervisor. James Gunn is one of those, right? He's always good at.
Taika Waititi definitely
can do that.
Yeah.
I think Edgar Wright does a great job with music in his movies too. Not just Baby Driver, but like music in general that he picks. And Tarantino is known for that too. There's no orchestrated score for this movie at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I noticed that. It's I feel like there's only those two songs actually is Stuck in the Middle and Hooked on a Feeling. And then I don't remember being any other songs. There was the radio playing, but
Yep.
it never actually played any songs.
The radio plays a couple of times. You mostly get the song at the opening credits, Little Green Bag, which I immediately, because of when I saw this and that was the first time I'd heard that song, or maybe just didn't ever write, like I associate it with that scene. So they did a good job there. And then Lime and the Coconut for the end credits. And most of, you're right, most of the scenes in the movie don't really have music to them. And any music that is playing is just kind of radio in the background, which, again, is kind of a cool way to do it because it's music that exists inside the scene that we're watching too, instead of being music laying over top of it. And I can never remember, diegetic is music that exists in the world that you're watching. Non-diegetic is the music like a score fitting over top of it, I believe is how it goes. But I love that use of diegetic music where, again, that same scene, he's cut the guy's ear off, Steeler's Wheel is playing, and then he gets up and he walks out, and we get that nice long take where he walks out to the car, and as he leaves, the music gets quieter and quieter and goes away. And now, once again, we're stuck in this moment with Mr. Blonde, and you don't really know what's coming until he grabs the gas can, and at that point, you're like, oh, I know what the end of this is going to be, and it's not good. And then because it's a continued single shot, you're just stuck there, and you're like, I don't like this. I don't want to see him set someone on fire. And so you know what's coming. And then the music comes back in as he goes back inside. And now you're back in this really weird place.
I did like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I like how that whole scene's going on and then it doesn't end the way that you expected it to. You've spent whatever it is, a minute and a half, knowing, like, seeing all the signposts and they're all pointing at the same spot. Like, this guy is going to set this other dude on fire after cutting his, like, this is terrible. And then you get, the gut punch, like the rug pulled out from under your feet of, nope, that's not what we're doing at all. What we're doing is arguably worse. And like worse, but also better.
Preparing yourself for it.
Yeah. And that to me is good storytelling and good filmmaking. um, because it
Yeah.
creates an emotional reaction in you. So I always like that, even knowing that it's coming after seeing the movie so many times. Um, just just the way it's executed, it just is lovely. It's like having, to me, it's sort of like eating a meal that you've had before and you know what it's going to taste like, but it still just is really good and it hits those right moments.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I feel like when I see stuff like that in a movie. It's that remembrance of like, oh yeah, yep, this is coming up, and oh, it's so good, still good every time. Um, so you mentioned at the top that you were kind of bored during the movie. What do you think?
Yeah.
Do you think that it's, could it be that it's a movie that is 30 something years old now? 31 years old, I guess it would be, or almost.
Probably. I feel like it probably would have held up a lot better had I watched it when it first came out, and even watched it maybe 10 years after it came out. It probably would have a little bit more for me. I think at this point it's very, very dialogue heavy, and the I don't want to say that the visual style of it is outdated, but there's a lot going on in it that today's society, it doesn't hold up to the same recognition, or the same it doesn't hold up the same as it would have when it first came out, or even 10 years after. I think society these days
Mm-hmm.
has in this movie that push the limits, very Tarantino. I'm gonna push the societal limits and see what I can get away with and what
Mm-hmm.
people are gonna be offended about. I feel like he always has to offend somebody in any movie he's ever released.
Sure,
He just has
I
to
can see.
find a way to offend somebody. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I think if this movie was rated these days, it would not be as high as as it is.
I can see kind of where you're going with that. And I think too, like last week, what I watched with Mark was a directorial debut. It was a feature film debut for Ari Aster with Hereditary. And comparing, obviously, Hereditary and Reservoir Dogs are not the same type of movie. One is a
Mhm.
weird psychological horror thing that I can't even describe, and the other one is much more of a dialogue driven crime movie. But they're both directorial debuts. They're both young directors that are making their mark. And what I notice watching, especially watching them back to back like this, is how far we've come in terms of what a filmmaker is capable to do early in their career. I mean, Tarantino, it's 1992, 91, I think, when he was shooting this. Um, at that point, the cost of making a film is very different from what it is today. Yes, budgets are higher today, but what you could get access to was also less. He had to shoot on film, couldn't shoot digitally at all. That didn't exist.
Mhm.
So he's got to buy he's got to rent a camera to do that. He's got to buy the film. He's got to have that film processed. The editing is very different. And on top of that, like what he can do effects wise all has to be practical. All of the blood, all of the squibs, all of that has to exist in the real world practically for him to shoot it. Whereas Ari Aster has the advantages of today's filmmaking and digital filmmaking is that he's got so much more open to be able to do to get your vision on screen. And so he can take a lot more, he can go a lot different places and a lot riskier with some of his stuff, which I think is really interesting. Um, and it does make for a very cool movie. But I think also it changes the sensibilities of like audiences as you're watching it, because now we're expecting better out of films. And independent film today is very different from independent film of the early '90s. So I can totally see where you're coming from on that.
Yeah, I think there's a very independent film feel to this too, and nowadays, you see movies that are released at Sundance. They're not, I feel like back then you had to go out of your way to watch an independent film that was released at Sundance.
Hmm.
And
Oh,
these days,
definitely.
like Sundance films are released in theaters too.
Yeah.
It's there's much following those types of movies these days. Whereas it was probably a lot harder for him to scrape together this movie, and some pieces of that suffered, whereas today it would have been done a little bit different.
Oh, sure. I mean, for one, today you've got streaming services, so you can put your movie onto like a streaming service is going to buy a movie. Look at something like Shudder as an example. Is a streaming service dedicated to horror films. So these smaller independent horror films have a better chance of getting picked up and put on a service like Shudder, where they're going to be exposed to a larger audience than they would have 10, 15, 20 years ago or more, where they had to. I mean, in the 80s, you had to basically rely on home video and hope that that would work. It sort of happened with this movie because it did end up getting picked up by a distributor after Sundance and a couple of festivals. Miramax picked it up. And they ended up putting it out in theaters, but it was only in like 20 something theaters nationwide, something like that. It's a very limited release. So the movie didn't do great in the box office either. It was only, I think it only made like $3 million. Granted, it was only in a few screens, so it's actually pretty impressive. But then it gains a cult following via home video. And also, I think, too, when Tarantino's next movie, which was Pulp Fiction, then gets all sorts of recognition and all sorts of award recognition and things like that. Retroactively, now people are going to go back and look at the movie he made before it in Reservoir Dogs. That's kind of how I found out about it. Was sort of the same thing. So that's a totally different thing than what you get now, which is like just the nature of watching films. There's so much available now. And in some ways it does mean that it's harder to kind of surface yourself because there's just a broader pool of entertainment to watch. But at the same time, if you are into certain genres or certain styles of movies, there are streaming services that can cater to that, and you can find these more obscure things. So it's kind of a 50-50, right? There's more available, but there's easier ways to
Yeah,
find what's available. So,
yeah, he might have had a better following.
mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. But he did go on. I mean, he's obviously gone on to have quite a career for himself, which is pretty fun in a lot of ways. Like, it's crazy to think that this guy who worked in a video store when he was in his teens and early 20s managed to write a script, make a movie, and now he hasn't had to work for a long time because his movies make a ton of money and he is well known in Hollywood, like him or not, and he is able to do what he wants to do. And I think part of that too is the balls on this guy when he was young making movies was pretty impressive. Because you mentioned how
I
like
feel like he still has a pretty impressive pair of balls.
he really
Because
does.
he comes out with movies like James. Yeah.
I saw an interview with him. He was talking about his way of writing scripts and how like he basically, especially early on, would just go into to meetings with producers and things and say, all right, here's the movie, here's the script, this is what I want to make. And
Mhm.
they would maybe say something, oh, maybe we should change this, or can you do something with the third act? He'd be like, no, that's the movie I want to make. If that doesn't work for you, I'll go somewhere else and somebody else will produce it. And he would write a script, and then that's the movie he wanted to make. And I buy that in a way because, again, I read the script for Reservoir Dogs, but there was also in '91 at that Sundance, he shot some of the scenes with actually with Steve Buscemi. And so they're early versions of the scenes we see in this movie. And the dialogue is word for word what we saw in the movie. So he wasn't changing a lot as it would go. And that's a very ballsy way to make a movie because Hollywood is not kind to people a lot of times, especially those that don't want to kowtow to the producers and kind of do what they want. Like I guess, and like it's Harvey Weinstein, so good on Tarantino for fighting him over it. But
Yeah.
Weinstein wanted to take the torture scene out of Reservoir Dogs. He didn't think that it should be in there. And Tarantino basically was like, no, I'm leaving it in, and fought with him over and over until he finally won the argument somehow, which is amazing because
Mhm.
you hear stories of people trying to argue with Harvey Weinstein and that never ending well. And yet somehow Quentin Tarantino
Yeah,
did.
I've been reading the memoir She Said
Mm.
about Harvey Weinstein. It's, I in it talks about how hard it is to argue with him.
I mean, he wasn't called the most powerful man in Hollywood for nothing. Um, so that's a whole other path we don't need to go down tonight, talking Harvey Weinstein, because yikes. But Tarantino was one that could butt heads with him and come out on top. So that tells you something. Um, let's see, there was some. I found some trivia, and I have to. Oh, I know what it was. There was a trivia bit that during filming, I love this because I love to find, especially IMDb, because it's editable by anybody that wants to sign up. I love to find trivia in here that I immediately am like, I don't buy that for a second. And this one was one of those. It said, during filming, a paramedic was kept on set to make sure that Mr. Orange's amount of blood loss was kept consistent and realistic to that of a gunshot victim. To which I say, horseshit. They didn't
Yeah, that
have the
doesn't.
no, they didn't have the money for costumes in this movie. Like the all the black suits that they all wore, those were donated to the movie by the designer of the suits because the person liked crime heist movies. And the rest of the costuming in the movie was basically they just told the actors, bring stuff from your home. And so that's why Chris Penn is wearing that track jacket, because that was his. And if you look, Steve Buscemi is not wearing
Yeah.
suit pants. He's wearing black jeans because they didn't have a pair of suit pants for him that fit. So if they didn't have the budgeting,
I'll have to rewatch.
yeah,
Yeah.
they didn't have the budgeting for costumes. There is no way they had a paramedic on set to make sure the amount of blood was the same. I just don't buy that. I do.
Yeah, that seems like a cost that they would.
Yeah.
Sorry, they that seems like a cost that they would just like not.
No, they're not thinking about that. I do buy though that Tim Roth apparently would get glued to the floor because they've got that sticky, basically probably like Caro syrup
Yeah.
type blood, and he's laying in that under the hot lights while they're filming. And if he would lay there for periods of time, and they'd have to like peel him off the floor at the end of shooting.
I could see that. Yeah.
Which does kind of crack me up. And Tarantino was going to have a dummy in there, and Tim Roth was like, "Nah, it's fine. I'll do it."
I'll just lay there.
I mean, heck, he got paid to lay in a pool, a puddle for a little while. That's not bad. So it's a good job if you can get it.
Yeah, exactly.
But this is the other thing I like about Tarantino's movies is like they exist in Tarantino's own world. That's basically our world, but shifted just slightly. Like they reference things that are real, like the scene where the four of them are in the car and they're talking about the TV show. None of them can remember the actress's name and all that. It's a real TV show they're talking about that existed, that ran in the 70s, that was made into a movie with Pam Grier. Like all of that's real. But then you're also in the same world where like they have fake brands for stuff or just things that happen that would never happen in the real world. You would never have an undercover cop involved in a robbery. Like it would never get to that point. The cops would probably step in at some point before the robbery could really happen, so that he's not put in a situation like he was in this, where he kills someone. So it's just like those are the types of things that like Tarantino he writes in this world that's ours, but sort of not at the same time. And I kind of enjoy that because it gives you this ability to sort of disconnect and just enjoy the weirdness that he puts in his stuff and some of the goofy things like guy leaves a crime scene but takes the time to go through a drive-through and get a pack of fries and a drink, because why not?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or one of his, and I always wanted to put this in a movie because I heard Tarantino talk about it in an interview somewhere where like a guy's running from the police or running from gangsters or something, and he breaks the window out of a car, gets into the car, looks down, and it's a manual, and he can't drive a manual. Like that to me is a wonderful gag that I want to see in a movie sometime, because I just think that's hilarious, because that could happen. And it's just that kind of
It could,
stuff
yeah.
that Tarantino can do that I think is great. So I know that you were a little bored watching it, but would you consider watching this movie a second time, or did it just not connect with you at all?
I might watch it a second time. I don't know about a third time, but a second time I might, just to look at all the little details that I missed. Like you brought up Steve wearing jeans. I mean, I would find that stuff really interesting. So
Was Is this your first Tarantino film that you've seen?
no, I saw Django.
Okay,
Um, I feel like I've seen more things that he's done too. It's just that I'm not normally
that kind of
me, so I tend to not. Yeah.
okay. I will say if this isn't your jam, it's hard to. I both want to suggest that you watch Pulp Fiction, but also
Mhm.
realize it's in that same era. It's more polished than this, I will say that. And what Pulp Fiction does have going for it is it is the same kind of disjointed time, but it's multiple stories going on. So you're not just following one small set of people, you're following a couple of people here, and then you'll get the story over here of some other people, and there might be a small crossover. You might see a character that was in one story show up in the background in a different story, and vice versa. It is still that same very dialogue heavy stuff. He didn't really start incorporating a lot of action until he got to Kill Bill. So bear that in mind if you do watch something like Pulp Fiction or Jackie Brown, that they are, I think Pulp Fiction being the better choice there, but it's very dialogue heavy. It's a lot of talking, because that's just Tarantino talks a lot. And so he's going to write a lot of talking into his movies. If you like Hong Kong films or you like kung fu films, Kill Bill is a lot of fun. It's also very violent though. So
Yeah, it has really good reviews and everything. So um, I keep.
yeah, Tarantino is very much a love or hate type of thing. You're either gonna like his movies and dive into them, or it's sort of like another director that I've been getting into more, and I wasn't when I was younger, is David Lynch. I think David Lynch is the type of director where you either really get into what he's doing, or it's too weird and you just can't wrap your brain around it. And Tarantino's sort of, you either really get into it or you're just like, I don't like this. I don't like the people. I don't like the dialogue, or they're unlikable characters. That kind of stuff can happen too. But I'm glad that you did watch this, because I do think as a film, I think it's worth every once in a while stepping out of your comfort zone and watching something you normally wouldn't. Um,
Yeah, yeah, I do think it's very different from what I would normally watch. So I do think it was good to, check it off my list.
I think also a thing like for me, it's easy to identify with this movie. There's not a female line. There's not a line spoken by a woman in the movie, and there's only like two characters that appear on screen that aren't guys, and that is the woman that he pulls out of the car that shoots Mr. Orange, and the woman that Mr. Pink pulls out of the car and steals her car. There's no other women
Okay.
in the movie. They're mentioned a couple of times, and they mention, because we don't see the heist, we don't see any of those characters, but I think that might also kind of play into, because there's no, without those kinds of characters, like it's easy for me to identify with the movie because everybody in the movie is very similar to me in terms of like what they look like, and kind of how they sound. Even if I'm not a career criminal, which I'm not, just to point out, FBI, if you're watching, I have never robbed a bank or a diamond exchange. But I think that also kind of plays into it, because I will say that most people I know that are Tarantino fans tend to be guys. He writes very male-centric stuff. He writes what he knows. That's who he is. Mr. Plaid, yes. That would be my code name, is Mr. Plaid. So I wonder, I do wonder if that played into it at all. Like, if they had more interactions with women in the movie, preferably positive ones, if that would have made a difference in kind of your watching of it or not. I'm always curious about stuff like that.
It might. I maybe because it started off with the whole conversation of Madonna's like a virgin. It was kind of a very in-depth conversation
Yeah.
about what she meant by it all. I mean, that kind of is like, that sets the tone for the movie right there, that these are misogynistic men. So,
That's a
I
very
mean,
good point.
maybe, yeah, they're very opinionated misogynists that are also racist. So I mean, those are all the type of people that I'm not, crazy about. So I I wouldn't be surprised if maybe there was somebody that was a little bit more likable in it, if it would have been so.
Yeah, it is a lot of, like, all the characters are these hyper masculine, toxically masculine guys, and there's this hierarchy that gets set up, and they're all intimidating in different ways, which I do find fascinating. But they're not. I mean, likable is you're right. They're not likable at all. Like, the closest you get to likable maybe is Harvey Keitel, but then he immediately flips to talking about, smashing somebody in the nose or cutting off their finger if they don't do what you tell them to do. So it's like, well, he's not exactly a good guy. But he's got this like intensity to him, and then you juxtapose that with Mr. Blonde, who is, from a intimidating standpoint, like the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of energy, but for some reason that's as intimidating, if not more so. It's really weird. And like how just they all interact, because none of them want to back down. They all have to be the alpha, and that just doesn't work. So that's how you end up with a standoff of everybody pointing guns at each other because nobody wants to be wrong. So there's some of that in there too, and I think I can agree with
Yeah,
you that
they're very dominant men.
yes. Yes, they are, and I do agree with you. If there were somebody more likable, and I think that is something that happens in some of his other movies. There are characters that get more likable. There's still, I would never call many of the characters in any of his movies completely likable, because they all have their dark sides. That's sort of just a Tarantino thing, like everybody does. But they definitely, on the whole, become more likable, and some of them are much more charismatic too. Sam Jackson as Jules Winfield, for instance, he's a hitman, but he's also very likable at the same time, because it's Samuel L. Jackson. How can he not be? So, it happens. But I'm glad that you got to see this and can kind of check it off your list, and now you can tell people, yes, I've seen Tarantino. I know, which is good. But it's been a fun conversation about this too, because I like getting your perspective on it. I like hearing that, a movie that for me still is kind of a touchstone moment, as well as something that I can go back to a lot. And I don't think about it as being boring, but I can completely get where it's just long scenes of people talking and about a thing that we never see.
It really is. It's a lot of dialogue about action that you don't get to watch.
And that, that can either be your cup of tea, or you can just be like, I don't care, I didn't see any of this, just move on to the next thing, please. So yeah, I can totally see that. I did capture a couple of audio clips though that I thought were kind of funny. I'd like to play for you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course. I'm not
I
sure what happened with my webcam. I think it died.
Oh, that's okay. As long as you can hear me and we can hear you, that's the important part. So
Yeah,
that
as long as the guys could hear me.
yeah, the opening diner scene is very iconic for this movie because again, it sets up and it tells you about all the characters right away, and it just has some great Tarantino dialogue of like quippy one-liners and comebacks. And I liked where Mr. White takes the book from Joe, and so you get this idea that they have a relationship that is at least friendly enough that he can pull that off without just getting punched right away. But then Mr. Blonde's like, "You want me to shoot this guy?" And I love the response to it, which is,
"Shit. You shoot me in a dream, you better wake up and apologize."
Like, there again is that sort of that hyper masculinity of like, if you shot me in a dream, you better wake up and apologize to me. That one kind of always makes me laugh. I did get the radio, which is kind of its own character in the movie, as the K Billy's super sounds of the 70s. It was
Yeah.
absolutely perfect to have Stephen Wright be the radio voice because he is the opposite of every radio DJ you have ever heard in your life. Are you familiar with Stephen Wright?
It sounds familiar.
So he's a comedian. And he's a stand-up comedian, and his shtick is that voice he was using for the radio. That's how he does his stand-up comedy. He does all of it with that deadpan, monotone, very slow delivery. And so to have him being a radio DJ just cracked me up. But I loved the way he said when he was talking about the monster truck rally. Because again, it's that like whole slow thing of, on Sunday there will be a monster truck rally, and then the name of the truck he gave cracked me up. This is the way he says,
the Behemoth.
The Behemoth.
I was laughing about that too. It doesn't even sound like Behemoth.
It's so good. Let's see. In talking about Mr. White and Mr. Blonde and how they're kind of opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of sort of how animated they are, because one yells a lot and the other one's very quiet all the time. I did like, and this is a very Tarantino thing again, just like how they reference Pam Grier and they reference that show. Mr. White has this big blow up and he's yelling at Mr. Blonde and he's pointing a gun at him. He's saying all this stuff. And his response to it is,
"I bet you're a big Lee Marvin fan, aren't you?"
I'll bet you're a big Lee Marvin fan. You familiar with Lee Marvin?
No.
So he's an actor, and definitely prone to fits of yelling like that. It is very Lee Marvin style moment. So that one is, again, Tarantino kind of showing off like, yeah, I watch a lot of movies. I'm going to work it in just because. So a couple more that I had. One was, I say this a lot because of this movie. Anytime I'm with a group of people and we're getting ready to go do something, I always like to say,
"All right, Ramblers, let's get rambling."
Because for me, that's just funny. I don't know. It's silly. But I definitely took it from this movie. As well as anytime there's a bunch of cars parked in an area, I always like to say,
"First, we got to get rid of those cars outside. Looks like Sam's hot car lot out there."
Sam's hot car lot. Something with that rhyming that gets me. Like, obviously, it's reference to a used car lot, but that's one of those that I say a lot, and I can tell when people have seen this movie or they haven't based on how they react to me saying that. So, but I'm a huge dork, and I speak fluent movie quotes, so that's just me.
That's why it's fun to speak with Mark Ellis, because he is definitely the cinephile of us all.
yes, that definitely does happen. But this has been a lot of fun because, again, I'm getting a different perspective on a movie that, to me, I view as nearly a masterpiece of a film, and it's really always intriguing to me to hear a different type of opinion on it, and then for it to be something that obviously you didn't see 20 years ago or 30 years ago, and you're seeing it now, and you're seeing it through the lens of today, and how it didn't quite land, not really your thing. And I think that is one of the things that I like about film, is that it's going to hit people different, because I'm sure somebody else could see this for the first time today and maybe it does hit them differently. But what are the factors going into it that are different from yours coming to this for the first time? You mentioned this isn't really your style of movie in the first place. So it's already like the movie's got to do something more to kind of pull you in. And I think that in the case of Quentin Tarantino, it just doesn't do that. It doesn't quite grab you and pull you in. And I didn't even think about, but you mentioned it, and it's absolutely 100%. That opening scene, that's going to either draw you in or put you off, with them sitting around that diner and the conversation that they're having. And the first thing you hear is about the Madonna thing, which, by the way, I thought was hilarious. She met Tarantino like a year or two later and signed a copy of her album for him saying, Quentin, just remember, it's not about dick, it's about love.
That is very good of her.
But she apparently liked like the idea of that interpretation, but that it was wrong. And I just think that that's pretty cool. But like, that's the first thing in the movie. So immediately I can understand that the misogyny involved in that, and the fact that they are very unlikable, misogynistic men. Now the movie's got an even bigger hurdle to try and draw you in. And now it's just more of this dialogue, talking. And yeah, I can absolutely see how this doesn't land. But I am glad that you went through and did watch it, and you didn't hate it, did you?
No, I mean, there's movies that Joey has definitely made me see that I hate. But I wouldn't say I hate this. I just think it's not at all my genre of movie.
Fair enough. I mean, that's completely valid. I do think that love or hate, there is a craftsmanship to this movie that can be appreciated in terms of just like seeing a young filmmaker, and you can kind of see this. And even if you don't like necessarily as like somebody who watches movies, you can be like, oh yeah, I can see how that guy continued to have a career after this, as opposed to a movie.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was watching this with my boyfriend, and he also was like, man, I'm really surprised that Steve Buscemi had a career after this.
Oh, boy, did he ever too. And he was young making this.
Yeah, I know the amount of times that he dropped that N-bomb. I mean, it's surprising.
That is something that somehow or another Tarantino seemed to get away with, because he does it.
He continues to get away with it, seems, yeah.
And there definitely are people that don't like it, and you said it perfectly, where he basically offends somebody in every movie, in one way or another. But I think part of it is that he is portraying characters. That's how that character would talk, and it's not good. It's not something that you want. But it is realistic, and it's unfortunate that's realistic.
Yeah.
But I think
you did a good job when you said that he's unapologetic. He's
yes.
unapologetically himself, and that can kind of go hand in hand with his dialogue choices. Is, it may offend us, but the truth is that these things are spoken.
Yeah, and I think too, he doesn't glorify it. He doesn't make it like a point of pride. I always and look, this is from my perspective, so I am completely open to, if somebody wants to give me a dissenting opinion and tell me that I'm wrong, I will listen and have that conversation. But I always feel like when he works in dialogue like that, it's meant to make you uncomfortable, and it's meant to make you not like the person saying it. And it's also meant to be what they would have said, what that type of person would say. And, maybe he shouldn't do that. I am not qualified to say one way or the other, and if it's something that does offend you, then, that is a completely valid feeling behind it, because it's harsh language, but he has always been unapologetic about it. And he's just like, this is what it is. And in some ways, I think that works. So, it's just one of those. It's a part of it. It's like the violence of it. It's the fact that you have a character who spends 90% of the movie lying in a puddle of blood. That's not something that's easy to watch or deal with, or the whole torture scene. All of that, it's meant to do something to you, and get a response out of you, and you may be intrigued by that, or it might put you off and make you walk out of a theater. And there's nothing wrong with
Yeah,
kind
he
of
definitely invokes feelings.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And as Phil in the chat says, he's never portraying it as this is cool, isn't it? Or isn't it cool? It's always bad people saying these things, and people that you don't like using language that you would never use, but that is how these, terrible people speak. And it's sadly realistic, and I wish that it wasn't. But it is. It's kind of like a movie that will drop drop language that we wouldn't use today, but they said it a lot in the 80s. And it's just it's a thing that we evolve and we get better. And so I think the fact that we can notice those things and be upset by them is a sign that we are evolving as a species, hopefully. You never know. Now, you are part of the So Wizard podcast, and this has been our 4th week. We've had all of you on, which is always so much fun. Very different movie for you and I to talk about than the last time. Last time we talked about Better Off Dead, which was about as far away from a Tarantino movie as you can get, really.
Yeah, this one was, I was going through all of the things that I haven't seen, and I gave Joey a list, and he just he just kind of took what he thought would be good.
Well, I'll tell you what. Next time, you and I will hash out the list, and we'll find something. We'll Joey can make his own list for his own movies. But I do think
I was surprised he's never seen Hook, though.
I was too, to be honest, because I felt like everybody saw that movie for a period of time. Like it was just everywhere and kind of inescapable. So it amazes me, the movies that people don't see sometimes, because you just think of them as being ubiquitous, and it's not always the case. Everybody's kind of got a different background, which is cool. And what's fun about doing this show, as a cinephile, I watch Tarantino movies and I get into those, but if you're not that type of a cinephile, or your movie choices are just in a different direction, you're going to like different movies. And so then that's a conversation that can happen, and we can look at different things. So it's like, it's always fun. It's just fun to have these conversations and get these different perspectives on stuff. So again, I'm glad that you got to watch this one, and suffer through it, for the show. So thank you for that. Luckily, it was the shortest. It's the shortest of Tarantino films. So, that's another thing to keep in mind. If you do watch any other Tarantino stuff, is it's a lot of the same type of filmmaking, but longer.
Oh yeah, maybe this one was a good one to pick then.
This was the good litmus test to be like, ooh, can I do Tarantino or not? Because it's only an hour and 40 minutes long. I think Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is just shy of 3 hours. So, yeah.
That's rough.
It's a lot. I don't mind a 3-hour movie, but it's got to be paced well. I feel like Tarantino paces his movies pretty good, but I don't mind dialogue-heavy scenes. If dialogue heaviness is not something, then that 3-hour movie is going to feel like it's a day and a half. So, bear that in mind if someone says, hey, you should watch this Tarantino movie. Take a look at the runtime and decide for yourself. I might steer you away from some of those, is what I'm saying. I might be like, maybe not, unless you have to for a show. But I do think that getting to see, again, something kind of out of your comfort zone, or out of your normal zone when you do talk movies, because this is the kind of thing where some of what was in this movie can kind of seep into your brain, and you can look at another movie with some of this in mind too, which can kind of change how you view and how you see movies. So that's always a fun thing to do, especially when you do a podcast where you talk about movies a lot, which you guys do. So It's very cool. And remind people where they can find So Wizard as well.
So we're on pretty much every single podcasting app you can find. We're on Spotify. We're on I know Apple Podcasts did a thing at one time. Joey's probably laughing hysterically listening to me flub this all out. And every single podcasting app, Joey signs us up for Podbean. I think even Google has a podcasting thing. But if you go to sowizardpodcast.com, you can find our episodes. You can click on the link and listen to it on any app that you actually have. I know everybody has different apps. So.
Absolutely. Excellent. SoWizardPodcast.com is where you can find it. And what I like is that you all have different perspectives. And so you get a good mix of voices talking about these movies too. Like you said, Mark is very much the cinephile.
Yeah, I'm very cynical.
Which honestly, you need to have, because not like all the voices on a show shouldn't be the same. That makes for better conversation. And I also know
we're very different.
Yeah, and I know from talking to Joey that you don't do the horror movies, so
I don't. Yeah.
I've told him in the past, hey, if you ever need another voice for it, and he's like, well, Aubrey doesn't do any of the horror movies, so when we do one of those, I'll give you a call. I'm like, cool, I'm down for that. And I don't blame you.
Yeah, we went to one and I almost passed out, so they're like, we're never gonna make you go again.
Ooh, now I want to know, what one was it?
I don't even. I think it was one of the Halloween movies. Actually, I get so anxious that then I hype myself up, and then my heart rate gets going, and then I'm like, oh no.
And that's the thing.
It's really.
Yeah, and like horror movies are meant to put you on edge and increase the anxiety. So if you're going into it already anxious, that's not going to get better. So. Hey, it's good to know your limits, right? It's good to know what you can and can't watch, and there's literally nothing wrong with that. So I'll jump on those grenades for you in the future if you need.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
But Aubrey, thank you so much for being here. This was a lot of fun, and it was a very good conversation. I hope that you had a good time.
I did. Thank you so much. I'm sorry my webcam crapped out halfway. So.
That's okay. I don't worry about that too much at all. Definitely, if you liked these past few episodes of this show, check out SoWizardPodcast.com. Download it. Phil Rude in the chat said that So Wizard had one of the best segments he saw during live stream for The Cure, which...
Oh, that's so sweet.
And that was awesome. I am going to work on being involved in that next year for sure. I talked to...
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I talked to Gerald from Two Peas on a Podcast a lot, and he and I were talking about that, and I've started getting to know some of the other people involved in it, knowing you guys, so I definitely love what you do with live stream for The Cure, and I want to definitely get involved more in that next year, instead of just being a viewer and donator. So wizardpodcast.com is great. Now this show I record it live Sunday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern time at twitch.tv/TVsTravis, and you can watch it there live. You can see the recording either on Twitch after the fact or over my YouTube channel at TV's Travis on YouTube. You can find the live or the recorded videos of this. Podcast-wise, it's available everywhere. But the easiest way to find it is go to tvstravis.com, and there you can find this podcast, other shows that I do, links to merch, Patreon for this show, where you can back the show for as little as $1 an episode if you want to. I have tiers on there that get you special Discord access as well as a monthly movie night for patrons, where we go through the back catalog of this show and let you watch movies that you hadn't seen before. I call it the movie catch-up night. So that's always fun too. So definitely check that out, tvstravis.com. It's a great website, Bombats, in the chat, who designed that website for me. So tvstravis.com and sowizardpodcast.com to find Aubrey, Mark, Joey, and all the stuff that they do. And So Wizard on YouTube as well, right? I think that's what it is.
Yes, yeah. Adam does our YouTube channel.
Yes. Yep, and having the four of you on has been fun. I'm not going to wait 2 years to have you back on, by the way. We'll do this more often.
Yeah,
you guys
definitely. Bring us back.
Absolutely. You guys are wonderful. So that has been Talking Reservoir Dogs. Aubrey, thank you so much. And
Thank you.
next week, what do I have going on for next week? Because I know I've got a couple pretty fun movies coming up. Let's see. The Fugitive. I have got somebody who's never seen Harrison Ford in The Fugitive before, and we're going to watch that. So that'll be a fun one.
I haven't seen that either.
Little less dialogue heavy, a little more action, but it's a tense movie. It's kind of a thriller. It's very good,
Okay.
But it is also early 90s, so you got to filter it through that. It's not going to be quite the same as an action. It's not quite an action movie, but there's things going on in it, and Tommy Lee Jones and Harrison Ford are great in there. I think
I love Tommy Lee Jones, so I probably would like it.
Oh, and this was the movie he won his Oscar for. He won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor.
I'll have to watch it then.
It's really good. So definitely check it out. And that's going to be next week's movie. So until next week, and until The Fugitive, which I get to watch, just remember to enjoy your movies and be excellent to each other. This has been Wait You Haven't Seen.
Dick, 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 dick.
How many dicks is that?
A lot.